presentation. We have a lot more events like this coming up, so please check out our calendar for more information. It's really my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Louisa Thomas. She is a staff writer at The New Yorker and a visiting lecturer in the English department at Harvard University, where she studies creating nonfiction writing. She's also the author of Louisa, The Extraordinary Life of Louisa Adams, which is why we're on here today. So please put your hands together for Louisa.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you to everyone who has put together all these amazing events for this amazing event. It's a remarkable anniversary at Quincy. 400 years. I told my 7-year-old daughter the event we were marking tonight, and she told me that she remembers the 100th anniversary. She really meant it too. It's an honor for me to be speaking here about Louisa Catherine Adams, and it's an honor for the memory of Louisa Catherine Adams too. Can everyone hear me over? No. Okay.
No.
I was thinking, I couldn't hear my own voice. Normally I'm disconcerted when I can hear my voice. But... Okay. I have been thinking lately what she might have made of it. I imagine, as was so often the case, that she would have felt pulled in different directions by different reactions. Shock, pride, confusion, some knowing wryness. She saw the vanities of men for what they were. Near the end of her life, when her son, Charles Francis Adams, told her that he had been nominated for president on the Free Soil ticket, she had to laugh. Little I, stood alone in this great nation as the daughter of a president, the wife of a president, and the mother of a nominated president. But she didn't end there. She went on. And after all, what is it? The worms will feed as well and no better than if I had died Miss Johnson. True enough. But what a rich life she left for us to feast on. She was born Louisa Catherine Johnson in 1775, 3 months before the start of the American Revolution. But in a fine house on Tower Hill in London above the Thames. Her father was a merchant from Maryland, an American patriot. But she was raised as young, pretty, wealthy English girls are. She spoke French, she played the harp, she attended parties, she was known for her fine soprano voice. John Quincy Adams met her as a young diplomat visiting London from Italy and fell in love with her in spite of himself. There was too much pleasure in her company, he grumbled to his diary. He was raised to distrust it. Their courtship might have been lifted from a Jane Austen novel, really. Jane Austen actually happened to be born the same year she was. It was so full of tenderness and wit and terrible misunderstandings. As in the novel, there was finally a proposal and a wedding. But Louisa's life did not end where the marriage plot did. In fact, her wedding was only the beginning of her adventures. She lived in Berlin, Washington, Quincy, St. Petersburg. She traveled across Europe, from St. Petersburg to Paris, by herself with her 8-year-old son, with the wreckage of war converging on Paris with Napoleon, who had just escaped from Elba. She was friendly with the legendary Queen of Prussia and with the Tsar of Russia, and when she was older, with any number of young men and women who met her and looked up to her. She ate canvasback ducks with Thomas Jefferson, and stole the limelight in one important moment from Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. She helped her husband become president of the United States. Her life had extraordinary range and spanned an extraordinary period. When she was born, the United States did not yet exist. When she died, they were only a few years away from the Civil War. But she did not see herself in such epic or triumphant terms. She was often in poor health and was called herself frail. Her beloved baby girl died when she was 1 year old, and 2 of her sons died when they were young men before born. Of the 4 children she gave birth to, only one outlived her, and half a dozen miscarriages, probably more. There were other difficulties as a mother, long periods of separation from her children, which were largely and sadly out of her control. Her marriage was not easy. John Quincy Adams was a fearsome partner, brilliant, principled, distracted by world events, on which he had such a big part to play, and trained by his parents, Abigail and John, to distrust the easiness, the comfort, and anything that gave a hint of his raging ambition. For her part, she could be demanding, dismissive, critical, resentful. It is clear to me, after spending years reading their letters and writings and the accounts of them that others left, that they loved each other as much and more as when John Quincy died, as they did the day they set out to Prussia as newlyweds. But the path from Prussia to the Capitol Rotunda, where John Quincy died, was long and not always smooth. And part of her trouble has to do, I think, with the sense that wherever she was not quite sure she belonged. John Quincy could look at himself and know that he was an American, an Adams. He knew who he was because he knew where he was from, and he was from here. He was from this place, from Quincy. Louisa was not. She arrived here in 1801. It was a long, punishing trip from Washington, where she had just said goodbye to her dying father. And that had followed a long, punishing trip across the sea from Europe. They arrived at the end of November. You know what November looks like around here, right? Quincy. What shall I say of my impressions of Quincy, she later wrote. Had I stepped onto Noah's Ark, I do not think I could have been more utterly astonished. The day after her arrival was Thanksgiving, a new holiday to her too. Everything about it was strange. They went to church or meeting, another weird word, which was nothing like the Anglican services she was accustomed to. The place was bleak, the singing was plain, and she wrote that people were snuffling through their nose. She was glad she felt so depressed and ill, she later wrote, for she would certainly give it mortal offense. This was, at least in part, an act. After all, she just traveled from Germany and Prussia and lived in foreign courts and had been aboard a ship for weeks and weeks. She had surely been looked upon as different before. She had seen any number of unusual things. Only Quincy did she describe in such exotic terms. Dr. Tufts, she wrote with an exclamation point. Deacon French, Mr. Cranch, old Uncle Peter, and Captain Beale. Captain Beale got 3 exclamation points. Then again, perhaps it's not all that surprising. One never feels quite as much a foreigner as when they meet the in-laws. Only John Adams took a fancy to her. She made a point of saying that he was the only one. Abigail, for her part, treated her like a, quote, fine lady, which was decidedly a bad thing. She deserved Louisa's separate, fancy dishes. She called her other children-in-law by their first names, but Louisa was always Mrs. Adams, or damningly, Madame. Louisa, for her part, didn't help. I longed for home with an impatient that made me completely disagreeable, she later wrote. In short, I was, in every respect, anything but what I should have been. It is part of her remarkable story, and indeed, part of the Adamses' remarkable story, that Abigail and Louisa came to love and respect each other. In fact, many years later, the great Adams historian Lyman H. Barfield wrote that in the entire span of the Adams dynasty, no figure is more central than the wife of the second Adams statesman, J.Q.A., and yet none is less known or more elusive. She was elusive even to herself. And it was that quest to try to understand herself and the world that she moved through so widely that drew me to her. She wrote 3 autobiographical sketches, Record of a Life, Narrative of a Journey, Adventures of a Nobody. She wanted to leave a memory of herself at the same time. Everything with her was always in tension. There was so much ambivalence. She wanted to let people know that she was, as a quote, one who was, and she underscored who was. There was hope because of her husband's work in Congress and because of her family. Not just the famous people, too. When I venture to anticipate what the rising generation are to produce, she wrote to Abby, her daughter-in-law, about watching her grandchildren grow, I am lost in ecstasy of wonder and entirely deny Solomon's assertion that there is nothing new under the sun. And as John Quincy thundered against the slave states in Congress, Louisa thought and questioned and tried to understand the great questions of the day for herself. And she included her own life and her own role as a woman in Quincy. She read Abigail Adams' letters and was, quote, struck, she wrote, by the vast and varied powers of her mind, the full benevolence of an excellent heart, and the strength of her reasoning. She added, I cannot refrain from wishing they were published. She wrote to her son Charles, I cannot believe there is any inferiority of the sexes as far as mind and intellect are concerned. She was not a feminist, make no mistake, but she knew what she was talking about because she had been tested, and not only in a physical sense. She lived her life moving through the great world, but she also lived in her reflections upon it. There is actually one moment I want to come back to, and it's not here in Massachusetts. Her reflecting was. It was 1836, and Louisa was in the throes of grief. 2 short years before, she had lost her second son, her third child. She worried at times that she might lose her mind, but she did not retreat into despair. Her third child had died, I'm sorry. She began to write, and she wrote about a remarkable period, the trip she had made across Europe. This was narrative of a journey. For a year in St. Petersburg, she had been living alone with her son Charles, while John Quincy Adams was in Paris, helping to negotiate the Treaty of Ghent that would end the War of 1812. Then she received a letter from him, summoning her. There were no instructions aside to sell the property, no route suggested, no places to stay, no guidance, really. I mean, think about this for a moment. You're talking about 1814. She's a woman alone. She doesn't speak Russian. She speaks French. Okay. She was on her own at a time when women rarely traveled, let alone under such vast distances. Narrative of the journey begins at 5 o'clock on the evening of 12th of February, which happened to be her birthday, the moment she departed St. Petersburg, and it ends the moment she arrives in her husband's hotel room in Paris. It was written in the tradition of American autobiography meant to encourage emulation. She wanted to show that women were stronger and braver than they were said to be. She was, as ever, ambivalent. It was her weakness, she said, that gave her the faith that she would be protected. But she was also clear about her strength. She wrote, under all circumstances, we must never desert ourselves. I actually wanted to read a little bit about her journey. I'm picking it up in the middle of it, in Berlin. She's already been through Latvia. She's been through the snows. She rode a sled. She had hoped that a letter from John Quincy would be waiting for her to tell her which route to take out of Berlin. She waited, and nothing came. She delayed her departure, uncertain of what to do, certain that her husband would instruct her. Finally, with advice from others, she looked at the map herself and set her course. On Saturday morning, March 11th, she set out and traveled southwest towards Potsdam and Leipzig. She knew this land, these sandy roads. She'd been here before. But as they continued west, she began to see something that unnerved her. Small groups of disbanded soldiers, hungry and ragged, who were in no hurry to get home, and who made their living off the road. At another time in life, Louisa might have fainted or fallen ill. Now she made her small son lie flat upon the carriage floor, while she put on his toy military cap and held his toy sword, so that the silhouette would show through the window. 2 male servants rode on the roof. They were armed. They drove toward Leipzig, and wished she would have preferred to bypass, and which, the narrative of the journey, she would say she avoided because the battlefield that she would have to cross there was famously grim. But she was either repressing the memory of the carriage or rewriting it, because in fact she posted a letter from that city. She would have had good reasons for wanting to forget that place. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813 had produced more than 100,000 casualties, an average of 30,000 a day. Tens of thousands of men were taken prisoner, all the farm animals killed for 10 miles around, the houses and 60 villages destroyed. Even now in 1815, more than a year after the battle, the fields remain littered with random wreckage, straw, rags, harnesses, guns, carts, the decomposing bodies of animals and men. No one had cleared the land since the fight except scavengers looking for scraps of leather or iron, something to melt down, stitch, sell, or eat. She passed quickly through the devastation. The carriage entered the Thuringen forest, the land of Goethe and Sturm. The forest was now as famous for its real horrors as its literary ones. She was on the path that Napoleon and his army had crossed, not once but 3 times, looting, raping, and burning. She could calm herself by saying the path was now safe. Napoleon was a prisoner in Elba, and the war is over. But one night in a town that was, quote, once probably strong but now in ruins, miserably conditioned, she said, an innkeeper told her of a rumor. Napoleon had escaped Elba and had landed on the southeastern coast of France. When she stopped at another post station, the rumor was repeated, and every time the carriage stopped for fresh horses, the news grew wilder and more detailed. It was said that he had an army of 1,000 men with him. Disbanded troops were answering his call. He was traveling north toward her destination, toward Paris. A mile outside of Hennin, on Thursday, March 16th, Louisa passed ditches and mounds like graves. Then she came upon a plain, quote, over which there were scattered remnants of clothes, old boots in pieces, and an immense quantity of bones laying in this plowed field. This battlefield, perhaps seeing the light in Napoleon's return, affected her as other battlefields had not. She had to keep going because now there was no doubt about the truth of the rumors about Napoleon. The former emperor was back. On March 12th, when Louisa reached Leipzig, Napoleon was in Lyon with the thousands of troops. When she reached Hennin, he was nearing Auxerre, for fewer than 100 miles from Paris. As Louisa advanced toward Frankfurt am Main, excuse my pronunciations, traveling faster and faster, the postilions pushing the horses, she saw evidence of soldiers mustering. Towns were busy with activity. She stopped in Frankfurt and visited her banker. Yet again, she hoped to find letters from John Quincy that would guide her. Yet again, there was none. She was more dismayed by the silence now because she was faced with a crisis. Her 2 male servants, John Folling and Baptiste, came to her in Frankfurt and told her they were resigning, afraid that if they returned to France, they would be conscripted into Napoleon's army. She tried to bribe them to stay, but their fears were bigger than her inducements. She asked her banker, Simon Moritz von Bettmann, to find her new servants. Bettmann was in a good position to help. Leroy de Frankfurt, he was among the richest men in Europe and the most well-connected. The Prussian king, Frederick William III, had first laid eyes on Louise at a ball at Bettmann's. Tsar Alexander, one of Bettmann's guests, had slept with Bettmann's wife. But when Louisa asked him for help hiring manservants, he shook his head. It was too dangerous for a lady to be on the road now, he told her. He could arrange for her to stay in Frankfurt, he went on, and he would offer her his protection, an offer that was rarely refused, no doubt. But she was becoming accustomed to expressing her determination. I insisted that it would be better for me to get into France as soon as possible, she said. And she added that if events were indeed so dangerous, she was sure her husband would ride out to meet her. She reasoned that the discord around Paris might actually be an advantage. She could slip through any barricades that were set. Bettmann was grave, but he could not stop her. He urged her at least to take a more circuitous path to Paris in order to bypass the troops massing on the city's frontier. He promised to find a servant who might help protect her. In the end, the only male Bettmann could find who had agreed to travel to Paris was a 14-year-old boy. So at 4 p.m. on Friday, March 17th, the new group started, Louisa, Madame Babette was the nurse, the nanny, Charles, and the boy whose name she never gave. He was such an unlikely protector that she had him ride inside of the carriage instead of on the roof, as an older man had done, because he was vulnerable and made the carriage seem more so. And probably she wanted to talk to him because she liked people's stories, and this boy had a good one. As a young aide to a Prussian officer during Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812, he had seen the emperor up close. He talked of Napoleon, quote, sitting among his soldiers to warm himself, of his partaking their soup, she said, when they had any, his kindness to them in the midst of their misery, etc., etc. That was her account of his life. Yet the boy had seen the devastation that Napoleon's campaigns had caused. So, quote, at the same time, as the boy spoke of Napoleon with reverence, quote, he expressed a great hatred of the man, with all the petulance of boyish passion. She, who knew something about a conflicted heart, was fascinated to watch the workings of this man, she wrote, swayed equally by admiration and detestation. As she moved through the post stations, changing horses and postilions, the number of troops on the roads increased. Their songs grew louder and their shouts more poignant and aggressive. She crossed from Germany into France and arrived at the town Strasbourg, where the master of the house advised her that the situation was unsettled and very critical. To her relief, he was able to find a manservant named Dupin, whom she could trust. At Epernay, she stopped for a, quote, capital dinner and the best bottle of champagne she had ever tasted. She assumed that she could afford the break, having received assurances that the troops would not pass through the town until the next day. But then, a mile and a half outside the town, she heard women hurling vicious curses at soldiers nearby, and then she heard the voices of the soldiers themselves, who had spotted the distinctive shape of the Russian carriage. Tear them out of the carriage, the soldiers cried. Kill them. It was the Imperial Guard in their blue uniforms and feathered caps. Louis XVIII had fled, and Napoleon had reached the Tuileries, where among those to greet him was a man Louisa was well acquainted with, the former French ambassador to Russia, Armand de Caulaincourt. I don't speak French, I'm sorry. Napoleon's elite unit was now on its way to meet the former emperor in Paris. Louisa's carriage was surrounded. Soldiers held the horses and turned their guns against the drivers. After seeing her passport, a general cried out that she was an American. Vive l'Américain, cried the man. Vive le Napoleon, she cried in return, waving her handkerchief. Vive l'Américain, ils sont nos amis. She rode very slowly with the convoy. The general who had shouted to spare her, rode by her side. As it happened, yet again, she was lucky. This general's name was Claude Etienne Michel, and he had served Napoleon for many years. A day after meeting Louisa, when he reached Paris, he would be made a Comte d'Empire, and a few months later he would play a role leading the assault upon the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo, where he would die. Now he spoke to her through the window of the carriage and told her that the situation was very dangerous. The army was, he said, totally undisciplined. She must provoke no one and show no fear. When the soldiers cried vive, then she must cry vive in return. When they reached the next post house, they must spend the night and let the troops pass. She was lucky, he added, because the quality of her French, she would not raise suspicions. She could pass for native. She listened to all of this calmly, though her heart beat loudly in her chest, while Charles, ice white, sat frozen, and Madame Babette shook. At the post house, the woman in charge refused to take the travelers in, because she knew that she could not protect them. She relented only when Louisa promised to hide with Madame Babette and the child. Inside the chamber, once its windows were shuttered and the door barred, Louisa's body finally collapsed, and she suffered a series of faintings, headache, and sickness, she called it. Charles was able to sleep, but Madame Babette was cracking. She had escaped the French Revolution, only to find France, only to return to France to find another about to begin. Clutching at her hands as fat tears rolled down her cheek, she said she was lost. The revolution has begun again, she insisted, and this was only the beginning of its horrors. Outside the door, men were carousing and drunk. The innkeeper, a vivacious woman of 40 or so, had the good sense to bring out the casks so that the soldiers would not trash the hotel in search of drink. At 9 the next morning, the place was quiet, no locks turned, and the doors open. The 14-year-old boy was waiting for them, a little worse for wear, prodded by bayonets, his Prussian cap taken and burned, but not harmed. They piled back into the Russian carriage and continued. When she was older, her family yet again called her the mother, but it was not an insult anymore. As a boy, Henry Adams liked to visit the madam in her room in Peacefield, not far away from here, where you would find her at her mahogany desk overlooking the flowers of the yellow wood tree. A vision of silver gray, he described her. John Quincy gave him one type of inheritance, which we can see reflected in Henry's magisterial works of history, a story of laws and arguments and great deeds and conflicts. From Louisa, he got something else. Quote, some of those doubts and self-questionings, whose hesitation, those rebellions against law and discipline, which marked more than of her descendants. Both were and are, I think, part of this great American project. When Louisa died, both houses of Congress adjourned as a remark of respect. The first time in history such an honor had been bestowed, Charles wrote in his diary. A huge funeral procession led her coffin to its resting place. Charles was later told that the President of the United States, the heads of the department, and the naval and army officers were all there. He noticed almost no one at the burial. He was overcome, he wrote afterward, with loneliness. I never questioned her kindness or her love, he wrote in his diary, and her going leaves a blank which nothing can replace. At December, her body was reinterred here at the United First Parish Church, the Church of the Presidents, which was filled with granite from Adams's quarry. She was not a member of that church, and she had never quite felt comfortable there, but it was her choice to be buried there. In the end, it did become her home. I'd love to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Why did the house adjourn for her? What role did she play that they respected her so highly?
Well, at that point, to answer the question, why did the house adjourn for her? Given that they had not done it, I'm sure there was no established protocol. But she was very much a well-known figure in Washington. She was sort of seen as this very dainty old lady who was, everybody respected her in this way. She had played a very big role in the social life of Washington up until the point where she was too feeble to do so and had a stroke. And I think that there was also a kind of, I'm actually speculating a little bit on this, and I actually think that some of the historians in this room could correct me, but this was at a point where there were more established norms for this kind of thing. But I do think that it was a kind of just a notice of respect. Something should be done to mark her death.
Was her husband at that point in Congress?
He was dead at that point, so he had died.
He had already died.
He had already died. Yes, he had died several years before, and he'd actually died.
On this floor.
Yes, on the floor. So he had a very public death. Literally a public death. And in fact, there is a very wrenching scene that she describes, and she rushes to the Capitol. She's been told that he's collapsed, and she wants to go be with him. This has been her partner for more than 50 years, and they won't let her see him. They won't let her, and so she's held back, and she's devastated by it. And in some real sense, he died a public death, and she, it was part private and part public. And in fact, Charles Francis Adams had planned only to have friends be pallbearers, and at the last minute he added, I think, like secretary and something and a senator. I mean, he added public figures in part because he thought actually she had a partly public life too. But it was a very, this kind of like public-private question is very interesting when it comes to the Adamses, to what extent they were part of the fabric of government. Yes.
What would you say she had for accomplishments while she was First Lady?
While she was First Lady, not much actually. First of all, she was coming out of a tradition in which the First Lady, with the very notable exception of Dolly Madison, was really not even seen, not just not heard, but not seen. Elizabeth Monroe had been her immediate predecessor, and without playing doctor from just many years hence, it's pretty well established that Elizabeth Monroe had some health issues that may have wanted, despite being this kind of regal, beautiful woman that everybody admired, she wanted to stay out of the public eye for a variety of reasons. And that sort of established a protocol that Louisa was following. And the other thing was that she was very much in the public eye in the campaign in the years leading up to the presidency. And John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State. And I think that had been a particularly bruising campaign. And once she got to this miserable palace, as they call it, and found it in total disrepair, and was very, her sort of performance at that point was very stagey and not her normal kind of vivacious self. She sort of was, operating under this kind of very strict sense that she should not, be mingling with people a lot. And she was actually, that was the most strained period of their marriage as well. And yeah, she didn't do anything basically in the White House besides be sick. But that was not actually that unusual, particularly given the protocol that she had witnessed from Elizabeth Monroe. Her contributions were more kind of before and after in terms of her role in John Quincy's career. But I also have to say that, I really kind of struggled with this for a long time while writing the book, because people kept saying, what did she do? What were her accomplishments? What did she, she's not Abigail Adams. And to me, what was so interesting was what was happening inside her mind, and obviously you cannot see across into anyone's mind, not even the person sitting across from you, let alone someone who was living hundreds of years ago. But she wrote so much about what she thought and felt that we get a clear glimpse into her complex mind than we do into many women in those days. And so this kind of inner life was vivid in a way that maybe her, advocating for certain policies or law, was not quite what, say, Abigail's was. We'll go in a circle. Yes.
Anyone here from Christ Festival Church, because that was her home church, right here in Quincy.
Yeah.
And just recently they have found a score and the lyrics.
Did you email me about this?
I wrote you about
yes,
it.
and I have to email. It's wonderful. I mean, I'd love to
I'm the
hear.
person that's...
Yes.
I didn't think you were going to find my email because I found you in the education, and I also watched your interview on public television in Ohio or somewhere. And it's on YouTube, so you'll be there forever.
Oh dear.
So, there was a young artist in Quincy who performed that song at the church.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and he did a fantastic job.
Wonderful.
And he happens to be my grandson.
Well, as you say,
So, if you want to speak with him,
I would love that. I would love that.
It was a big pleasure meeting the person here now.
That's
So
wonderful.
yes, not very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We will follow up. And at the Smithsonian, they have some of her songbooks. with her, writing, copying Mozart scores and some of her own compositions.
Yeah, it's actually it has, I think, 6 stanzas.
Yeah.
I think the young artist only did 3 or 4, so.
Yeah. Well, she wrote poetry, she wrote plays, she wrote music. She was busy. If she was not.
So her contribution was in the arts
Yeah.
rather than in politics.
Yeah. Oh.
In her book, The Account When She Went from Russia to France, which is absolutely fascinating, did she talk about the weather and how did the carriage fare and how did that all work?
She did a little bit. So she spent actually a year and a half writing this narrative of the journey. She wrote two drafts. She pretty clearly consulted John Quincy Adams' diary. She said she did no research, although her geography was actually really good. So I would be shocked if she did not look at a map. Her memory was actually quite good. So again, the facts that could be corroborated, you can corroborate. She posted a letter, saying that she was one place that she said she wasn't. So, there may be some error, but she was using names and everything. Those are real historical, figures, people. And there's a very good account of a book that totally reconstructs her journey by someone named Michael O'Brien, which is worth reading. But yeah, she talked about the weather and she talked about just what life is like. But a lot of the details you can also get from other accounts. She wasn't saying it was Tuesday. I looked it up. So yeah, it's a lot of research is like triangulation. Someone else describes an event and they describe the weather. Okay, it's raining. So.
I wonder if you can tell us what sparked your interest in Louisa Catherine. And then you just mentioned research. Could you tell us a little bit about your research process?
Oh, sure. What sparked my interest? When I graduated from college, I spent some time doing kind of independent freelance research for John Meacham, who was a historian. And he was writing a book about Andrew Jackson. And one of the sources I was looking at were Louisa Catherine Adams' diaries from that time. And 2 things stood out. One, her name was Louisa. Perfect. And the other one was that her voice was so vivid and was funny. And I was reading a lot of diaries that were so boring. There were so many men writing about people they met, debates that were being done, and they were writing for posterity. John Quincy Adams actually was surprisingly frank about his emotions and his various opinions and things like that. He actually really did kind of lay it out in a way that was pretty rare. But a lot of people were just kind of, and a lot of the women's letters were kind of also boring in a different way. And she just was not boring, and she was funny. And I don't know, humor was just like opening a window, to let the weather in. And I was like, who is this other Louisa? And then I started to read about her life. And the more I read, the more I was fascinated. And at that point, there had not been another biography about her. In the time between this and coming out, there was the O'Brien book came out, and there was a biography about the first part of her life by a woman who died before she could finish the second part. But there's a lot of new stuff in there. And the really interesting thing, though, and I think that changed the trajectory of what I was interested in, is that I read a lot of, when I wrote the proposal, I'd done a lot of research, but I had not gone back and read her early letters yet. And so I signed a contract for this book, and I settled down, and I'm ready for the long on the microphone, and I start reading her early letters from her courtship, and they were so anxious and short, and such bad writing. And also she was kind of a pain in the rear. And I was like, what have I done? And so tracking, but it has turned out to be such a gift, because she was not fully formed, at that point. And the story really became about becoming. You know, this was like, I feel like a lot of times biography is about you have this person who did these things, they were president, they passed these laws or whatever, they, you know, have this kind of iconic status, and then the story is like teleological. How did they become who they are? You know, and this was to me a story about this kind of, there was a searching quality to her, or kind of a restless quality to her, something like essentially exciting because it was in some ways like dynamic, and part of it was just about like the development of this voice. You know, to go from someone who basically wrote like 3 lines. She started her letters, her early letters, like 3/4 of the way down the page, so that she could like only have this much time. And she just wrote about how much she hated writing. To go from that to someone who spent a year and a half, you know, writing a really vivid, detailed account of this incredible journey, you know, many years after the fact. You know, and thinking about, you know, as she said about Abigail's letters, I cannot help but hope that it would be published, you know. She's writing that at the same time that she's working on this thing. Not that she imagined that anyone would publish it, or that anyone would be writing her biography, but that was a trajectory that also as a writer was interesting to me. Yes.
Could you talk more about the coldness Abigail had towards Louisa, and I wonder if that created friction between John Quincy and his mother?
Well, there was definitely, I mean, so John Quincy and Abigail had a fascinating relationship. She was tough on John Quincy from the start. You know, at like the age of 10, Adams people can correct me, but at the age of 10, she wrote him this letter, and he's being sent to be his father's secretary. She was like, I have dedicated you to our country, and I would rather have you sink to the bottom of the sea than disgrace this country and our family, basically. So she was like, she could be a bit like tough. I also think that she had a kind of distrust of anything, well, naturally British, you know, as Louisa was, in some sense. And, but I also think, having a mother-in-law myself, that some of this is just like the way of the world. And actually it's kind of fun to sort of see the different kind of patterns that repeat. But at the same time, Abigail was the one, and this, as I was saying, I was interested in this development of a voice, and part of that was just through the practice of writing. And Abigail became Louisa's great correspondent. You know, once John Quincy Adams became too busy, and he was, you know, doing big things, Louisa took over the job of writing the elder Adams these long letters about life in Washington and politics and family life and all this stuff, and they wrote her back, and they developed this really warm, actually, and generous relationship. And when Abigail died, Louisa and John, you know, she filled to some extent the role that Abigail filled as his great correspondent. The question about whether there was friction between Abigail and John Quincy, they were incredibly close, but I also think that there was already friction. He didn't need Louisa. But, you know, I might say that the choice of bride, you know, was maybe telling in some sense, because, and John Quincy's ambivalence. Abigail, he avoided telling his parents that he married Louisa. And she guessed, and she was angry. But, you know, kids and their parents. So I answer to some extent.
Oftentimes when I started the project or research or anything, I had preconceived notions, okay? So you answered part of the question, which was what enticed you into it. But then at the end, when you finished the book, when you finished your research, were you happy about what you found, or were you disturbed about what you found? Was there closure to what you found?
I would say there was closure. say this was a, yeah, I mean, I think you go through many stages in working on a big project. But this was like, I mean, this was a 5-year period of my life, but this is a bit weird to say. I feel like it was the great project of my life, not counting my kids. Yeah, I sort of feel like, I don't know, if I never have someone as interesting as her to write about, I would be okay with that. Yeah, and I did feel, you feel so intimately involved. One thing I did was, I had sound tracks. So I had, I had different requiems for each of the deaths. It was sort of fitting, and I used 4A's requiem for her, because it's very beautiful. And you do it, and you're really good. Hermione Lee is this great biographer who I admire, and she told me once, you need to have a good cry. When you kill off your character, you want to have a good cry. So I listened to 4A's requiem and had a good cry, yeah.
She died, she died at the age of 77. Did she have underlying health issues? Because by today's standards, I don't view 77 as being very old.
By those standards, it was great. It was pretty old. Yeah. She did have underlying health issues. In fact, it was kind of amazing that she lived as long as she did. It's hard to separate out what was original. She had epilepsis. Am I saying that the way I say it all the French words? Eripelius. She had something that was a virus that is related to streptococcus infection, which would flare, but that was not like a fatal thing or anything. And she was constantly fainting and sick. But again, like, you have to understand also the circumstances in which they lived. They were living in these like smoky rooms all winter, and she getting laudanum, leeches. I mean, it's hard to separate sometimes what's the illness and what's the cure. And the other thing you notice is that there's a certain pattern that emerges, which is John Quincy Adams never notices her until she's sick. Which I don't know if that's intentional or not, or coincidental, but certainly she talked about being sick a lot. I do think at the end it was a stroke. It was like but health is really kind of hard to unpack in those days in the best of circumstance. I will say that she has, like, before in the past few years, when I think she's getting more of her due, biographers would always write her as this kind of like frail, kind of Victorian person, which she was not in a lot of ways. And I think they were kind of accepting. Even if you look, there's like the Daughters of the Revolution with some plaque about her in the church, and it describes her as this like quiet, tender, frail. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that's not the woman you meet if you read her letters. But yeah, 77 I think was actually like pretty good.
Comment. I loved your book. I thought it was great. I was shocked by the lack of agency she had about it. It's just like, definitely not like that.
Yeah, I mean the big, I don't know how to spoil it for her. She had to leave her sons for a long time, and she was not. They didn't tell her. This was all done in arrangement. Abigail Adams, very much in charge, arranged it all, and they basically didn't tell her until she was boarding the boat. And like, that was of all of the things in her life that hurt her, that was the big one. Any last question? Go too forever. Yes.
How about Louisa and Old Hickory?
Pardon?
How about the interaction?
Oh, yes. She quite admired him the first time they met. She was like, ooh, he's actually very gallant. I was expecting I think she wrote the savage. But she threw this really big party. There was every year there was a big hall, like there was this day basically to celebrate Andrew Jackson because of these military exploits that he found in the Battle of New Orleans. And she had a very canny idea. So there was going to be this huge ball for him at the public house, and this was during the height of the candidacy and presidency, and all the board people would go and be celebrating him. And you could imagine if you were running for president, but also supposed to pretend that you were not running for president because you were not actually supposed to run for president in those days. It was very bad to campaign. Dangerous even. You can imagine that would be not good for your prospects. You would want the attention to be on you. So she was like, let's throw him the party. And it was like called the Jackson Ball, but it was really her ball. And she just threw this huge party. I mean, it was like, there were chalked eagles on the floor of the ballroom, and the bonfire was lining the way, and every punch, ice cream, confection you can imagine. And she was wearing this like steel dress, that was like shining. So she was this kind of like lit figure, and everyone at Jackson's ball, including and everyone came to their party, and by the time he finally left to go to like the actual other Jackson party, like no one was there. So it was that's not why John was being president, but it was a moment, it was, and she called it her campaign. I want to thank everybody for coming, and